Thomas. A year later, welcome back to Workshops Work.
Thank you very much for having me again. A year and 1 month. I checked earlier today when we spoke for our first episode, an epic one.
Mm-hmm. And I guess release date will then be almost exactly a year later.
That's really exciting because a lot has happened since.
What has happened? Are you still calling yourself a facilitator?
I'm actually not sure I called myself a facilitator back then. Because I know that you asked this question now almost every guest. So I was really reflecting over it. And like, did I actually did I call myself a facilitator back then? I wasn't sure about it. People said that probably to me that I was, but I'm not sure I considered myself that. But yeah, I'm now calling myself a facilitator.
Yay! And what has changed over the past 2 years? The pandemic hit. We moved to online. We moved to crisis mode. So crisis mode is our new normal. And crisis mode is your old normal.
Crisis mode is my normal, yeah. In a weird way, not always the mode, but like the mindset, maybe. Given from my previous life, so to say, when I worked with crisis management and in crisis zones and in conflict zones, and we talked a little bit about that last time. And I think that mindset is just something that sticks with me. That I kind of need that somehow. And those who have been in workshops with me, they might know that there's always something that doesn't go according to plan or shouldn't go according to plan in order for me to feel comfortable. But I just think there's a lot to learn. And for me, it was interesting to observe the past 2 years, what happened with us, our mindsets, not only in facilitation, but generally, how we dealt with it. And there was a lot to learn for all of us. And I hope we take these lessons.
Can you maybe point out 1 or 2 learnings, and especially with what I have in mind when I ask the question is your most recent Never Done Before workshop, where you use the tagline, why every workshop must be addressed like a crisis?
I think it all starts with me having a bit of I'm trying to demystify the word crisis a little bit. I have noticed that whenever we throw the word crisis in a conversation or whenever it's a headline, something happens to us. We go in an immediate alert. And I like to ask people. So, I mean, let me ask you. So what's the opposite of a crisis for you?
Control.
Sorry, I didn't hear.
Control.
Growth. Okay. So some people might say stability. Others might say the opposite of a crisis is calm. Everybody has kind of the different opposite of a crisis. So that makes it difficult to talk about a crisis as something we all see the same way.
Can I just pause? Because I think this is that's very strong, that by trying to identify the opposite, we actually realize how difficult it is to define what it actually means.
Yes.
Thank you.
That's a wonderful way of showing that we have different perspectives of things. That actually doesn't only work with crisis; it works with other things as well. And big crisis is just even more obvious because we use this word so much, but we all experience and put something different in it. So if I lack stability, this is the wonderful thing with this is if I lack it, I know that that's what I will be working towards in a crisis. So if you say growth, then that's what you'll be.
I said control.
Control. There was a bit bad sound before, but if you said control, then that's what you will be aiming for. So if you ask people that, you will naturally get the answers what they will be striving for when they're in a crisis situation, and that gives you information about not only what they'll be doing, but also how you, as for example a facilitator or somebody works with them, what you can do to support them, where they need to go. But when you bring people together and exchange their experience on it and say like, well, I like stability, so you like control, for example, then we have to find out together. So how can we work that both can be present? What can we create that this crisis situation is actually a common situation? So we have to explore a bit beyond. So when you say the opposite is control, means like you maybe not feeling in control now, or you lacking control right now. So what is beyond it? What would you need in order to feel in control? What would I need in order to have stability? And you kind of explore a little bit options through that already. So a huge learning is that while we use the same word, we mean different things. We experience different things. So we must not assume that when we talk about somebody else, like about the COVID crisis now, that this person means the exact same thing that we mean, because that's very likely not the case.
Thank you. What I also hear, or the other related epiphany I just had by listening to you, is that by how we cope with a crisis situation also then means that we might tend to overstretch this opposite. So that there is our shadow. And I realize it myself that I do have, especially when I'm stressed and when it's kind of crisis mode, that I tend to try to over control. And then this kind of restricts me almost. And I can imagine that if you're then thriving for stability, that it might just keep you in your comfort zone, doing things as you're used to instead of trying out new things that might be needed in a crisis mode. And I might need to let go of control in a crisis mode.
Yes and no. I think it's what is interesting with this point is that that happens when we look for those things in spaces that we can't influence. So if we try to control things that we can't influence, we try even harder because they're so far away. So if there's restrictions, sticking with COVID, if there's restrictions that we can't do anything about, and they make us feel like we're not in control, we have not really identified our problem yet. Mm-hmm. So I like to give this example with the travel restrictions, very relevant for us as facilitators. If I keep thinking that the travel restrictions are my problem, I will never be able to control it or get stability in any way, because that's out of my influence. But if I reframe it in my head, what my actual problem is. So for example, how can I keep doing facilitation with the travel restrictions in place? I immediately look at my scope of influence. What can I do? And not what are the travel restrictions? What is this thing that blocks me, right? Because I associate the power, the blame, the influence, the control to something else. So that's when I try to really overcompensate on other things. The moment we refocus on our scope of influence, this automatically gets less, because we feel like there's things I can decide, there's things I can control, there's things I can do here. I actually have a space where I can control things, where I have my stability. But it's really about refocusing on that space. That is the key. And as a collective, I think it's very interesting if you discuss with teams, within companies, with friends, if you discuss the crisis and exchange how you experience it, this tunnel vision, right? That has its advantages, and we can talk about that after, but the tunnel vision opens up a little bit, because you immediately in that, like, I can't control anything. What am I doing? Somebody can take you out of it because they give you a different perspective, and it widens automatically, like, oh, and they actually haven't looked upon it that way. And facilitating that dialogue is, for example, something that everybody can do, but that also we as facilitators can really do.
It makes total sense that you open the vision and you create opportunities, possibilities. And then how do you then align them and bring them back together, especially if a group, because the energy is still there, you're just channeling it in a different way. So how do you then bring it back together into something grounded that is a possibility and not headless chicken?
Or through focusing on or really specifying the problem. This is one of the biggest blind spots that not only in crisis, that I generally see in when we're called in for facilitations and doing workshops, because there's this phenomena that we most of the time called in when there is a problem. But we also, and that might resonate with some listeners, we also as externals often see what the actual problem is, while the people might define it a bit differently. So that really, like, grounding them again and bringing them back together is really specifying, finding this common problem. What is it that we really need to solve right now? And what I like to do is I work with people on their resources. I take a starting point in their resources, saying like, so what is it that you have? And I noticed that a lot of the times we don't know resources that are available. And for me, everything is a resource in crisis, right? I keep referring to one of my childhood heroes, which is MacGyver, which was basically a private detective who had this special superpower to kind of reinvent things and use and combine things in very tricky situations and always get out of the situation somehow. And I think this mindset is what is key in a crisis, in a difficult situation. It doesn't have to be a crisis, even just any problem solving where you're able to let go of predefined conceptions, of mental models that we have, that this is how things have to work and this is how we've always done it. So it's really about like going back, looking, we have lots of resources here and we use a fraction of our resources. And that's not even physical things. That's also knowledge, experience, traveling. Resources, something like creativity. If you can stimulate that, it's a huge resource. And if you use those things, take a starting point in like, you have your problem here, you have all these resources, you immediately, it's almost like a little game that starts. So what can we do with what we have to work this out? And that's when usually the energy comes, when the ideas come, when the options come, and immediately you have the feeling like it's not the context throwing something at me and I can in a problem decide that or that. I can actually in a problem decide that, and half of it we have created ourselves. Half of these options are something we came up with. If we choose them at the end or not, doesn't matter, but we have a feeling of control. It shows us we're not just helpless here. And that is an immediate change in mindset and positive motivation.
I love the concept of MacGyver and everything is a resource, where you can also use the resources you have in different ways. And that's where the creativity comes in. So it reminds me of the conversation I had, I think just after hours with Tamara Eberle last year, 2 years ago. What if we don't have sticky notes? Then suddenly we see all the other resources that we can use as a substitute for the sticky notes. So if we put on the MacGyver lens, what are the resources we have and how can we use them in different ways than we're actually used to in order to solve the problem we have?
And this is maybe the second learning, since you asked me before about learnings. One of the key learnings that I see I have observed is that we are not aware of how that we all are MacGyvers. If we look back at simply at our profession, beginning of this pandemic, and how in the beginning there was really a resistance in the facilitator community against, and I was on the forefront, of course, of this. You know me, digital facilitation. It's not the same. And then something happened, because all of a sudden there came new tools. People started, I can actually experiment a little bit. They saw the opportunities in it because they had to. There was no other way. So we came to a point where we're like, okay, we have to arrange us with this. And then the moment this blocker is gone, there's endless opportunities. I mean, you know all about it. You have, I think, seen pretty much every platform or every tool there is through your work in the festival. But this, and we all do this, and not only in our profession. You remember there were all of a sudden these videos about home training and what you could not all do being in lockdown. And this is all the MacGyver mindset. All of this is. And sometimes we're just trying a little bit too hard to like, okay, now we have to solve this problem, instead of just trusting that we will solve it. Because when we're in a corner, we will. That there's a concept called creative desperation, which one of my favorite decision researchers has come up with. He's called Gary Klein, and he says there is moments when you have tried everything else. You have tried everything that is within your scope of imagination, and then you have to let go of everything you have believed in before, and that's when you come up with the actual solution of the problem. And it's really these survival stories. And there's this famous movie of this guy that was caught in the Grand Canyon, and he was stuck with his arm or his leg, I don't remember, and in the end he ended up cutting off his arm. But that was the last thing that came to his mind. In interviews afterwards, you hear that he didn't cross his mind. He needed his arm. and eventually let go. Well, I don't need my arm. I actually need to survive. And it's just this little mind switch, right? It doesn't have to be as extreme as in this example, but it just shows we have our mental models. We have the ideas how things work and how they function, and we attribute certain functions to different things. But if you let go, if you manage to create a space where people can let go of that and are challenged to really think differently, the sky is the limit.
I love the example in the extremity, literally, of the example.
It is extreme. It doesn't have to be as extreme always, but you know, I mean, you have been to some of my workshops, and I really like that when people play around with whether it's uncertainty or whether it's extreme constraints, right? I mean, the question workshop last year was about that. You just take away something that we so heavily rely on, and still you find solutions. Yeah. It was amazing to see. I didn't know where this was going to go, but the participants, you found solutions for the problems that were there, and this just shows we have it. But sometimes it's about taking that little push, and I think that can be facilitated, that can be trained. I think the MacGyver mindset can be trained. Yeah.
I agree that the pandemic was a good teacher for that, and maybe that's a silver lining, because it's almost as if it gave us permission to just try new things. And I remember the months where the pandemic hit Europe, and the lockdown, and losing all the clients. And the thing that made me survive, air quotes, was I woke up every morning and I repeated the mantra, I just won the lottery. I pretended that I won the lottery, trained this mindset, and then thought, what would I do if I won the lottery? And that's how Never Done Before came to life, which was pure fun. Yeah. Bring the community together to play and to experiment and to try out. And then things emerged from there. But it's to let go of mental models of, I need to make money. It needs to be lucrative. It needs to follow a certain scheme.
And it's also the paradox in it, right? It's let go of control in order to regain control. And as you say, what you say is the wonderful thing. It's like there's no better time. This is kind of the silver lining of the crisis word for me anyway. There's no better time than to try out things. Mm-hmm. And there's two ways of approaching crisis, right? One is to really say like, okay, I'm just looking what happens, how the situation plays out, and I'm reacting to it. And this is the more common way of doing it. And it's natural. This is how it has evolved also with the crisis terminology and the whole communication around it. And then there's the way we say, okay, this is the rules have changed now. There's not really new rules yet. So I'm just playing along until there will be new rules and see how that works out. But I'm maybe even contributing to shaping these rules. Mm. And this is what happened, whether it's in the facilitation or in other companies. And those who came out well of the crisis, they did that. They tried out new things. They said, okay, I mean, either way, we're now in a squeeze. We can wait passively and just try to survive, or we can try to survive and actually make something out of this and innovate and try to reinvent what we have, look at things differently and try out new things. And I think this mindset is just very important. And this doesn't have to do anything with crisis as such. It's just triggered through the word. But I think this is a mindset that we generally should have, because this is a mindset that helps us also outside crisis. And companies or people who do that, who have that ability, they often don't face a crisis. That's the interesting thing, right? And they're not the ones who say like, well, we weren't in a crisis, because they had already the ability to adapt and work. For them, there was hardly disruption. They just continued working as they did before.
The question is crisis a mental model? And how do you define a crisis? Because then I wonder, isn't this something that often is tried to be ignored? Oh, we're not in a crisis, it shall pass, just have to sit through it, and then suddenly it's too late. So how do you communicate that crisis is actually a good thing? How do you identify a crisis?
I would also not go in a good thing. I like to stick with the neutral original definition of it, which was really just a kind of a decision, a point for decisions, a point where a turning point somehow. And I have actually, for me, what I did in this pandemic was I started to write and reflect over particularly my approach to crisis management and how I dealt with crisis, and also observing what happened around me, because I thought it was a good moment to sit down and just reflect, because I had the feeling that the traditional crisis management tools, a lot of planning, and that never satisfied me, also when I worked with it. And so I asked myself a lot about that question. So how would I define crisis? And I think crisis is a very individual mental model. Yes, I definitely think so. And that is a bit connected to what I've asked you before. So what is the opposite of it? And so for me, I looked at what the crisis that I worked with had in common, and it wasn't much. So for example, time pressure that's often mentioned was not a criteria that crises have in common. The crises have that in common when there's really a decision that, well, a life or death decision. Yeah, then that might have happened, but that's not every time the case. It's also the pandemic. Yes, there was a time pressure, but it wasn't a time pressure that meant 2 minutes. It was a time pressure that meant a couple of days before you came with a decision, right? So this was not a criteria, but some criteria were common, and that was that decisions are unavoidable. This is not a moment. Take a relationship crisis. So not to talk about so big terms all the time, but a relationship crisis. When is a relationship crisis happening? That's really the moment when you avoided to either maybe discuss that you had problems before, or looked in the mirror and said, like, I don't really want to be in the relationship anymore, but I don't know how to say it. Or when there were conflicts that were not really addressed. And then you come to a point when you can't take it anymore. That's, you either break out, or it's a huge fight, or something. That's when you're in a relationship crisis, when you're in the corner, when you're like, I can't anymore, this is enough. So you avoided basically the decision before, and then you came to a point where it's unavoidable anymore. And in a crisis, it's exactly the same. Crisis is the moment and the periods for me when decisions have to be made, and those decisions, because of the timing, feel like they have a more severe impact than they might have had before, because then it's really already urgency. And as a third point, they lead to substantial change. Those are the three things that I saw in common when you look at crisis. And now when you take just simply the label away, it doesn't have to be a negative thing. Decisions have to be made. They're unavoidable. Leads to change, and we're all scared of change. Is another one of those big things that we're scared of. Leads to change. Yeah. And we have to take the driver's seat. So we have to basically be the ones who can decide what has to be done.
Related to that, what I hear is uncertainty, which is a huge threat factor for human beings. And the other one is a sense of urgency. I liked what you said about the time pressure, and that it's something that is very subjective. Yeah. I mean, was it Keynes who said, in the long run, we're all dead? Making fun of the economists who always, the macroeconomists, thinking of the long run. We're all dead anyway. So time pressure depends on how you look at things. But I think what I hear from what you explained is the sense of urgency, which is totally homegrown.
Yeah. The sense of urgency
becomes neutral. Yeah, and then it becomes something that you can work with and facilitate someone through. So, okay, I didn't want to interrupt, but I would be curious about the outcome. Then you said that during the pandemic you started writing.
Yes, and I'm really not a writer. I can't consider myself a writer now because the book is pretty much done. But this was really a tough journey. I have to admit that. I underestimated that fully, but it was also fun because it was not not like I did during my studies. And I think we studied the same thing, if I remember correctly, or at least parts of it. It was these academic writings. And this was not what I did now. I just really, it was a reflective writing. And that's what actually was enjoyable. It was difficult, it was really difficult, but it was enjoyable because if you have a brain as chaotic as mine, it's just very difficult to come to the point. And what is it that I actually really learned, like the essence of it, not to become like, not to use way too many words and have complicated sentences and all that. But really like, so what is it that the famous so what? And what I realized while I wrote was that it was a complete mix between, so I couldn't let go of also adding facilitation into it. So I realized the more I wrote this book, and the book is basically just it's a guiding model for me, how I look upon crisis situations. So it's different topics. I've identified 9 big blocks of what I look at. So for example, one of the topics is crisis management for me is managing people before anything else. So it's really like there's no crisis when people aren't affected. I didn't find anyone anyway, because nobody would label it like that if people aren't affected at the end of it. And because of that effect, there's always people who have either emotional reactions or have to deal with the situation. And when I looked back at the crisis management experiences I had, there were always people in the center of it. It became only difficult to manage it when I focused on the context too much and not on the people in it. And when I worked with the people, we could find ideas, as I described before. We could actually define the situation. We could deal with our emotions, something very important in crisis, completely underestimated, and all those things. And we could manage the dynamics. And then we're already at facilitation, aren't we? So I couldn't kind of let go of that idea that facilitation is somewhere in it. And the whole book then evolved around, like I had a lot of exercises that I came up with, exercises that I used in different situations. And the more I wrote, the more I understood that a large part of how I manage crisis anyway were facilitation competencies that I used and applied without knowing it back then, of course, because also tools and so on. And I do personally think that that's a bit of a blind spot. I being a crisis manager myself, I know that as a crisis manager, you basically sit and you have all the responsibility, right? You have to kind of make decisions, you have to sort information, you have to lead the meetings, you have to coordinate the people. So all falls on you. But technically you have a completely different role. The role is to get the team, the company, whatever you're dealing with through that situation best possible. Now you have to also design the process, and that falls short. Crisis management is often meetings, and that there's so many missed opportunities to come with creative problem solving, with design thinking, with all those things in it that actually would help us to find creative solutions for the situation. And this is what sparked a little bit my Never Done Before workshop this year.
Just a moment to reflect on that. What I hear is that a crisis manager and a change manager actually have a lot in common.
Yes.
And maybe the change manager is more aware of the similarities than the crisis manager. Going
back to the things that I said, for me, define crisis, right? And it's extreme change.
Yeah, that's why I was thinking of that.
So it's for me, it's nothing else. It's just a way how to approach this. And since it seems like you're at a cliff, right? And you jump off, or you're not jumping off, or whatever. But then there's also the thing, you can fly off of a paraglider, or there's a couple of other things you can do, but those things you don't see. It's usually the either or. If you come from the external perspective and have no responsibility for the crisis, but you can come with a process and say like, so, okay, I support you to actually identify your problem. I support you to look at solutions. And I have the toolbox here that we could use. And the problem is that crises are dealt with so seriously. It's exactly that mental model. Everything has to be serious, and it's all, there's so much at stake. And yes, true. But what's the difference of using a method instead of sitting in a meeting for 2 hours? Other than having maybe not a boring meeting that nobody wants to sit in and be way too serious, but actually let go of that seriousness for a little bit and might, through that, find solutions to it.
Yeah, wonderful. It's again a mindset thing where I think we're brought up that, okay, a crisis is not fun. We are not MacGyver, so we have to be serious and to sit in meetings and have serious meetings. Although if we would say, okay, we're in a crisis, let's put our MacGyver mindset on. How can this be fun? I mean, and this is maybe, it feels maybe itchy to think, how can a crisis be fun? But how can we use our creative energy in a moment where it's actually serious?
Well, if you, for me,
and maybe
crisis,
there's judgment in that, why that prevents us from accessing our creative energy in this moment.
it is, and it's a collective. I mean, as I said before, it's an individual mental model, but it's also a collective one, and that's the one that you just pointed out. And crisis, unfortunately, as a term, is used also to stimulate this. So basically, to, you know, it's when there should be urgency, when for political use, they just throw in the word crisis. And there's a fascinating book that I read, which is called Constructing Crisis, where a researcher worked for several years on. So he has the theory that there's no such thing as crisis unless there's a claim for it from a power position. And I find that very relatable, because I've said previously, before I read that book, I've said several times in trainings, like, for me, a crisis doesn't exist until it's called like it, right? Until somebody says it's a crisis. And that's very similar, but I didn't have the research foundation that he had. And this is what I've also noticed. So for me, it's a lot to take away this label again, because if somebody puts it in, you can also take it away again, because somebody says it, but doesn't mean I have a crisis yet. Doesn't mean that I have one. And often a company crisis is a beautiful example. A company crisis is very often projected on the people that are in it, but doesn't have to be, because the first thing in that situation would anyway, the company has to continue doing its work, surviving. Put your own oxygen mask first, put yourself between the pole and the one you're saving, to speak with the 80s TV show metaphors of Baywatch now. And so that's important, right? The business continuity. But then you invest what you anyway should do, because there's also economic models about it, a certain % of your time in innovation. And why, instead of crisis management, why are you not doing that? It's exactly the same process, only the one might lead to something that actually your company can take away with, and it's exactly the same outcome. You're finding a creative solution for the problem that you have. Or you go in a crisis team, have the mindset, we're not going to survive this, very negative, have the pressure, have the feeling you have to perform now. If you don't find a solution, everything's gone. So there's two different mindsets, and we've experimented with this in through communication. We have done simple exercises, very small, simple exercise. We've written 3 or 4 paragraphs about the same crisis situation, have split the team in a workshop in 2. One got the memo on, it's a difficult situation. Yeah, no, there was nothing of crisis in that memo. It's a difficult situation. There's really, the stakes are high. We're convinced we'd use this as a jumping port for innovation. So it was all about, like, we're there, we're going to do this, motivational, we have trust in you, whatsoever. The other one was like, it's a very difficult situation for us. We're struggling, we have no information yet. So it was all uncertainty, insecurity. This is really a crisis for our company, and so on. And the task was simply to write a 2-paragraph memo to the board, what your next steps were going to be. The difference was beyond anything I would have ever expected. So one was basically already making ideas of how they would solve this issue that wasn't even defined yet. Like, we're going to do this and we're going to do that and that and that. And the other one was saying, like, we don't know anything yet, really. We will get more information. We'll get back to you once we know stuff. And it was completely reactive. And if you translate that now into a company setting and the whole internal communication that you can structure around this, and how much potential there is to simply change that mindset simply through communication, trust building, reinforcing, like, we trust you, you find this, and actually letting go a little bit of the responsibility that very often the top leadership feels in company, and say, like, we trust you to figure it out. People might not even feel that they're so much in a crisis, because they would get empowered in, like, finding solution for this problem, and they will. There's no doubt about that. They always will.
Wonderful example. Intriguing outcome. would be interesting to replicate that on a larger scale.
Yes.
Where my experimental economics kind of past comes back. And I also wonder what the implications are on a larger scale, to come back to our cultural models as a society. So I have the impression that, especially now in the pandemic, that, and I observed that comparing Germany and the Netherlands, that very often I consider, oh, it's just the same. Oh no, hell no. In Germany, it's all about the crisis and the severity, and there's a lot of angst. In the Netherlands, maybe it's the extreme. They might take it a little bit too easy. Oh yeah, we're close to code black. It's going to be fine. Let's try to put the measures back in. But students can still go to university, no more than 75 students, independent of the room size. And let's have a lockdown after 6. The question is, to what extent will this then also result in more creative solutions, and what will be the actual impact? So what is the impact of culture and also expectations from the outside world?
The culture feeds, of course, into mental models for me. So we brought up, as you say, like a lot of the mental models are really from very early on that we have. I mean, the famous thing is, or the example that I always bring is, like, we all have an understanding of what table manners are, but they're all different. So, for example, I have this, I'm growing up with, like, you don't wear a hat at the table. So when I see somebody having a hat at the table, it's like, this doesn't work. It's not.
Yeah.
And it's just a mental model. It's just a hat, right? But you don't do that at the table. And this is already different from person to person, right? Or things you combine on, like simple stuff we eat, how you combine things. We got these lunch packages when we were kids. And if somebody comes with a combination that we have never seen, it's like, just doesn't work. You don't
eat chocolate with cheese.
So, so these are all things that we have from very early on, and they are also partly cultural. So I see that now, and you also. I mean, we've both moved away from the countries we were born in and lived in other countries, and now live also not in the country we were born in. And there is, even though they're so close, there's so huge differences. When you start to dive into the culture, you see that this is so different from where we are coming. Now Christmas is coming up. This is a beautiful example for how different things are, but also how difficult it is to let go of what you grew up with, what you are used to. So this is, I was confronted with this for years. It's like, no, this is not how we're doing it. This is, this constant voice in the head. And when you come to crisis, this is also the case. I see that as an advantage if you manage to facilitate that properly, because if you bring that out, if you said before, uncertainty for me is very similar to crisis and to other things, because what is uncertainty really? Uncertainty is that we don't know what's going to happen, and we have not really an idea of how things are playing out. Well, isn't this what's always the case? Aren't these assumptions that tomorrow things are going to play out the way we think they're going to play out? There's a likelihood, but at the end of the day, it's an assumption. And the reason why I realized this is I love to learn from children, right? And now I have 2 children, and when I observe them, and they deal with uncertainty constantly. So they're constantly exposed to situations they don't know yet. They have to learn, they have to explore, and they're just throwing themselves into it. And there's one reason why, and that's because they do not have the mental concept of uncertainty yet. So for them, that's normal. That's normalcy. They are like, they're used to constantly meeting new people, seeing new things, learning new things, but they don't think about it. We think about it, and that's when it becomes difficult. That's because we try to fill uncertainty with explanations. We try to give uncertainty a definition, which is technically a bit difficult, and that means also we're moving there with our minds, right? So we're stuck in something we can't explain, whether it's the unknown or whether it's uncertainty or other abstract concepts. Another beautiful one is time. For children, time means nothing. Like if I say 5 minutes to my 2-year-old daughter, she's like, whatever, I don't know what he's talking about. And for us, it means something. But that also means we can go there with our minds. They can't. And that's a superpower, right? That we lose when we get older. So I think there's a lot of things that influence us, and the different backgrounds, to go back to your question, the different backgrounds can be a huge advantage because they can actually add on to my reality. But we have to be open to explore them, not only ourselves, but also to explore them collectively. So be able to say, like, even between us, right? Austria, Germany is very often looked upon as so similar, and there's the culturally so similar. You and I know that that's really a myth. And so exploring simply that. So how do you do that in Germany, right? And how do we do that in Austria is just giving me maybe new ideas. It maybe actually helps me, instead of sitting in my position, thinking like I would manage this crisis now from what I'm used to, how I grew up, my mental models. I'm like, so what do you do? And maybe that gives me an idea.
But this, I totally agree with what you're saying. I think it's beautiful. I love the example also with the table manners. So true. And the challenge that I see is that it requires the slowing down, and it requires to work against our human instincts. So what you explained, the difference between a child and an adult is that a child doesn't have all the data points yet, because uncertainty basically means that we cannot allocate a probability to a specific outcome. So children don't have enough data points through their lives, so they cannot calculate a probability. Okay, let's try it and we'll learn.
MacGyver.
And then as adults, we're looking for probabilities, but they are all wrong because otherwise it wouldn't be uncertain. In order to use this as, or this differences in culture as an opportunity, we have to have this children's mindset, this curious mindset, which requires us to slow down, which is absolutely counterintuitive in a crisis. Because as you mentioned, we have a sense of urgency. It's maybe not real, but we feel we need to do something. So how do you get a group then to just...
I call it the magic moment, and we do it as facilitators, we do it all the time. It's a simple stop. Stop everything you do now. What's happening? What is happening right now? What are you discussing about? What is the problem you need to solve? What are the roles that you have? What is it actually that blocks us now? So this magic moment. In facilitation, we work a lot with exercises, and when we give the groups difficult tasks, and you give them not the last twist that you might just add once the task has begun. I do that. I like to do that. But you give them the instructions, and then and then I like to ask, so, you have now 10 minutes to solve the whole task. How long do you want to prepare for it? And then they would say, like, yeah, for about these 10 minutes, how much preparation time do you want? They'll say, yeah, 1-2 minutes, whatever. Then they discuss, in the 2 minutes, and we do roles, and we do this, and we do this. Then the exercise starts, and then, of course, I add a twist. So now this is happening, either constrained or they see that the task is a completely different one from what they thought. And instead of then sitting down again and saying, like, okay, let's take a minute. Let's just make clear that we all understand what we're doing now, because it's different from what we've discussed. They continue with the plan. And that goes pear-shaped 90% of the time. And that is because of the perception that they don't have enough time, because they've already taken 1 or 2 minutes. So they have already little time. So that feels like a waste of time. So this commitment bias that we have to continue with this because this is now our plan. And that stops them from actually successfully fulfilling a task that could have been done in 3 minutes. So the time was enough, but because they didn't have that magic moment and say, like, stop everything you do. This is not different. New situation, new task. Let's do this all over again, and then do it. They just waste time. And that usually happens. That moment comes, but then it's too late. And in retrospect, it's always the realization, oh, we probably should have, just stopped and looked at it. And like, yeah, And the thing is, this you can learn. You can make this a habit, but it needs to be trained. Like with any other skill that we have, it needs to be trained. And sometimes it needs to be done artificially, just simply to get that habit into your thinking. And this is what I try, also particularly in crisis management, regularly. Sometimes I assign a person, say like, this is your task. Every 20 minutes, this is your task. Just to check in, say like, so stop. Do we all know what we're doing? Is there anything that doesn't do anything? Are we all working in the same direction? And so on. And if you have that and say like, okay, this is your only task, you set a timer, that's it. I will be annoyed. I can also tell you that, if I have to manage you guys, I will be annoyed, but this is very important. Ignore that. I apologize in advance. And it's simply about getting that habit going, because after a while, it's not that person anymore. It's somebody else who does it. Somebody else is just like, okay, we haven't really stopped. Let's stop for a second. And it doesn't have to be every 20 minutes, right? But it needs to be done. It's particularly that moment that kind of gets you back, refocuses. Because that's also the beautiful thing about children is in those situations, they're constantly focused on what they can do and what they can't do. A bit what we talked about in the beginning. And that's why they always have kind of control. They won't attempt things that they don't understand or go with their minds anywhere else. It's like, can't do anything about it. I'm here and now. This is where it counts. That's for me, if you have that skill, you have a huge advantage. And the problem is, again, the time pressure, right? This perceived time pressure that we don't have the time and everything has to happen now. And we're always a step behind, and that you can change when you, through your scope of influence.
Oh, that also the perception of time changes as time evolves. So instead of saying, okay, we could agree on something in 2 minutes only. So let's take these 2 minutes or 1 minute to reflect on it. Gold. And I can imagine that through the exercise of interrupting every 20 minutes to ask, okay, stop, are we still on track? That after a while, this becomes a responsibility in every one of the team, where as soon as someone has the awareness, oh, I may be acting as a headless chicken, I'm doing something, wasting my time, or I don't know what I'm doing, that they would kind of snap the group out and say, hey, everyone, stop. Is still everyone on track? Because I feel that I'm lost.
And this is exactly what happens. And I have identified a couple of habits that I think contribute to this MacGyver mindset, but also I like to do that in workshops. That's a little exercise that I can share, which is just I either make it a game or make it a bit more open, but usually I like to make it a game. And that's when I just simply assign a couple of roles. Do you know the game Werewolf? So you basically, like, somebody tells a story and everybody gets assigned a card where they have a symbol on it. So there's werewolves, there's villagers, there's a healer, there's a little child, and they all have different roles. And then there's a storyteller. So you close your eyes, night in the village, and then the storyteller calls to different people to wake up. And the werewolves have to agree who they killed that night. And then everybody goes to sleep again. And the idea is to identify all the werewolves. So it's basically a discussion game afterwards, like who people think is the werewolf and why. And so it's like that. So you have to identify the different roles, and they have all different functions. And a little bit in the idea that I work with is that you turn it into a game. You assign certain habits to people. So for example, Miriam, you are today, so you get a card that's like, Miriam, you're today, or in a group, it's very important to regularly exchange perspectives. So your task is to be not discovered as the guardian of the perspective exchanges, and you have to, in creative ways, ensure that perspectives are exchanged regularly, so that we're not all looking at one perspective, but we hear different perspectives and so on. Another habit would be identify assumptions. So, so your task is not be discovered and not share your task, but you have to make sure in a creative way that we're identifying assumptions. Mm-hmm. And what you do through that is, on the one hand, you're building a skill already within at least one person, but it will be more afterwards. But on the other hand, you're also creating creative ways of doing it. Because it's boring after a while to say like, oh, we're identifying our assumptions, right? But since you shouldn't be discovered, you are identifying creative ways of doing it. Which
I
then
was about to ask why would you ask them not to be identified? It's because of the boredom?
It's because of the you don't want to kind of, a habit becomes boring if you do it the same way all the time, right? It becomes a routine, and routines are a little bit dangerous, when a little bit counterintuitive to the whole MacGyver mindset. But if you have just the habit and do it in a creative way, like a bit of a, I don't know, different ways of checking in, different ways of checking out, and all that, you actually maybe keep the energy high around it, and you can play around with the habit as well, for that stimulating your creativity on top of it. So it's all kind of connected, right? It's a bit systemic, the thinking there as well. And there's a number of habits, and I have identified a few, but every team, every company has their own habits that they can identify. So we want to do this in our team, and basically it's just a method that they can apply. And the idea with the game is then that you basically can say, the one who wasn't discovered wins, or the one habit that gets the most points, because you can also say, like, so here's all the habits that were distributed, which one did you feel the most during this workshop? And then they say, oh, we thought we constantly questioned our assumptions without even knowing it. Most points, you win something, right? So you can gamify this a little bit, but it's really all about creating those habits for this open mindset, this MacGyver mindset in a way.
Fascinating. Did you write that down somewhere? Or is it in your book, this game?
It will be in the book, and I'm actually making a facilitator tool right now.
Awesome. Because after I asked the question why it's important to add the restriction that they must not be identified, I came up with 2 more reasons why it's actually good. One is, you don't want anyone in the team who becomes the fact checker. Oh, you applied an assumption, I discovered you, or, oh, again, the same perspective, let's change that. So you don't want to have the Oberlehrer, how do you call it, the head teacher. Yeah. And the other one is, as soon as something becomes too much of a routine, we lose our sharpness.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Because we have the impression, we're doing this other, just, yeah, okay, checking the box.
Yeah.
And you don't really pay attention. While when you have to make sure that you're not identified while changing perspectives, you must remain sharp.
And you can also you can play around with that, right? So you can basically say, like, if every break, if you don't want to make it a game at the end of the day, you play around and you distribute the rules differently, so that different people have different habits. So you had perspective first, and now in the next one, you have another one, which would be making space for emotions. So you practice also the different habits yourself, and through that, you basically, everybody has had the habit once, or has tried the habit once, and this becomes your thinking. So you internalize the thinking, oh, we have to make space for emotions, this is a very important habit, and we have to exchange perspectives. Somebody else in the team might have also the emotions, but might also have the assumptions, or a third one in the team might have we have to, for example, learn from other sectors regularly. So basically, okay, how would they do it? How would they solve this problem? Just to simply bring in these different habits into the team, and they will, even if you don't practice them daily and always, they will come in handy. It's again a resource that you're building up.
Yep.
And brings us
awareness.
Resource. Yeah.
Back to MacGyver in the toolbox. I think the topic of this conversation will be what facilitators can learn from MacGyver.
This is a little bit what we discussed in the workshop in Never Done Before, was what facilitators, not MacGyver, but what facilitators and crisis managers have in common. And it's surprisingly much. And because it's not only the skills, but it's also the mindset. It's the mindset, it's the abilities, it's the things that you would underestimate that facilitators have, because nobody would maybe call themselves a crisis manager from the facilitators, at least in the workshop they didn't at the beginning. But there was really a realization that there's a lot more in common, and that's also to do with that crisis is such a loaded word, because if you demystify it, which we kind of do through our conversations right now, you realize there's a lot, it's a change situation, a radical change situation where decisions need to be made, and those decisions should be based on options for the problem identified. How similar is that to a workshop? It's very often exactly the same. And the context is also the same. It's, we as now from a facilitator perspective, what do we know about workshops? Nothing. What do we know about what comes out of the other end of a crisis? Nothing. We have to deal with people dynamics. It's the unknown. We try to create opportunities, try to facilitate opportunities, share perspectives, bring people together, build safety, which is lacking in a crisis. So we are assuming that it's also lacking in a workshop. So there's a lot of those things there as well. And we try to deconstruct mental models and approach things differently, right? And the list is way longer than that, but those are a few things that those have in common.
We have restricted resources that we need to use in new ways.
We try to make a plan, which I never, like, crisis management plans for me are the most dangerous things because you rely on them. We make a plan, and we have discussed this several times also on LinkedIn in comments. Agendas, yeah, they have a function. They can be guidance, but that hardly ever works out that an agenda is exactly what's going to happen at the end of the workshop, because you don't see the room, right? You don't know the people. You don't know how many people. You don't know any other restrictions that can come up. So you might have to deviate from that. And that's fine. But you got for yourself, you got an idea laid out. And the crisis management plan should be nothing else than that. It should be maybe giving an idea of what we could do, but you never know what's going to happen. No crisis can be predicted. The topic might be predicted. Yeah, there will be another pandemic one day when this one is over. But what and how and which virus and how this is going to look, nobody knows. So the plan might not be valid, right? And holding on to it is a little bit what we've discussed earlier in this episode, is when you really with the teams that get stuck on the original plans and they have to carry it out. And that's just what I often experience with crisis management plans. It's like, oh no, it's not in the plan. Yeah, but then you're not solving the actual issue right now. You're sticking to the plan, so you're focusing on the wrong thing. Same for us facilitators. An agenda is good, but it's not the most important thing.
Crisis plan, as much as a workshop plan, might rather consist, when I think back of the beginning of our conversation, of what is the problem, our perception of it, what are the resources we have?
Elements, yeah.
Were the individuals involved?
And the resources you pointed out before is a key thing. Yeah. We come with this bag of resources. We might need a fraction of them, or we might need many of them. We don't know. It's always up to the team. And your whole podcast and the work that you do is about building those resources, making us, on the one hand, aware of how much we actually have, and on the other hand, building those resources through learning from each other, through pushing the boundaries, through saying, like, because the whole never done before is about reinvention, is about the MacGyver mindset for facilitators. It's like, so what can we do what we haven't done? Let go of conceptions or concepts that we've had for years that everybody works with. Let go of them, and what happens? And so that this is basically very much linked to the MacGyver mindset and stimulating it also in us facilitators.
Wonderful. What makes a workshop fail?
You will get the same question from me that you get 2 years ago. I was expecting the question. I know you like it. For me, workshops never fail. They don't. It's because it's always about the perspective that you have on it. So if you say, okay, the goal in the workshop is we identify the problem, and you might not identify the problem, you still have a learning of why it didn't work to identify it. Because you can go into that. It's all about the questions that you ask afterwards. Like, so what happened in the workshop and what are we taking away? I'm generally not such a big fan of working with goals, because they take also away the flexibility of where the process is going to go. I'm trusting the process. And yes, we can come in with the ambition that, for example, we want to discuss, resource inventories. How can you do that? And we can show the method and so on. If this works with this particular team, I don't know. If the team buys it, I don't know. But what I learn is exactly that. So Is it a receptive method? Is it something that people can relate to? Is there anything methodologically I could have done? And for that, the workshop didn't fail. So it failed maybe for the original topic and intent, but for me, it didn't fail. And maybe for the participants, it didn't fail if we point out like, oh, you gave me feedback. You actually were actually a peer group that helped me develop this product. You saw that this doesn't work. You might walk away with ideas. So there's always something in it. And that's why workshops don't fail for me.
Thank you for the reminder. I just want to double check. I'm so predictable. I am not a crisis. Sorry. And yeah, it's a good reminder that we don't learn from things that go too smooth. If everything works out as planned, there's very little space, if any, for learning.
And this is a huge oversight. I'm so glad you bring this up, because when I work, learning is another topic, crisis, of course, but when I work with people on learning, this is usually the first question I ask. So what is going really well? And because what we overlook is exactly that reinvention part that we're talking about. Because we have adapted to the crisis and there were lots of things that are going well, but our natural focus is on, so what didn't work so well? And completely forgetting that we still got through the crisis, we still adapted, we found new ways of doing things, that all disappears. And with that mindset, well, that is actually what we should focus on. So how did we find these solutions? How did we come to new ideas, new approaches? Because that's what's actually important. That's what got you through the crisis, not what you didn't do so well. And it's a simple shift of mindset, but it's such an important one, because there you might find out, oh, what really worked for us is that we actually left, for example, the CEOs out of the crisis team. They made the decisions afterwards based on the solutions that we developed, but they weren't involved in the solution development. They could run the company and they could make way more unbiased decisions. That worked well for us. Instead of saying, oh, the communication between the crisis team and the CEO, that was a bit tricky because sometimes there were misunderstandings. It's a completely different learning. And one is very much worth, and the other one is not so much worth, because that might anyway look different next time. And that shift is so empowering if you manage to do that, both with teams and with, well, individuals, but also with companies, where you say, focus on what's really working. What did you do well? How did you come to this solution? And there might be so many little nuggets, so many secrets in that, and it's just powerful.
With a reminder. Is there anything that spoke a bit over an hour now, I think. Is there anything that you wanted to share, but we didn't touch upon yet?
What I have played more and more with now in the past months also is to not only compare the roles between crisis managers and facilitators, but also really the thought of working with crisis teams as a facilitator. So from the outside and how that would look. And I do think that's really something that we as a profession should be looking at, because I think that can be change management, whatever we call it. But I think that as much as I would like to, the term crisis is not going to disappear anywhere. So, and those are usually the ones that are shut out the first time, the people that have the tools and the processes. I really like this idea. I hope the community can kind of, is interesting to spar a little bit around it, because I'm playing with some concepts and I'm playing with a little bit of ideas around that, how you can really also put that label on that because I think we have all the tools, we have all the competencies, and you can facilitate those teams as well. But there is probably also a little bit of daring from our side, because I don't think it's a natural thing or natural thought even, which I've also noticed in the workshop, to, as a facilitator, to say like, I'm going to facilitate this crisis team now, because it's almost like coming into complete chaos, right? You're actually exposing yourself and like, okay, this is not going to be an easy one. But yet maybe that's exactly what they need. So maybe your task is there exactly to kind of give that order, give that structure that they might not have, ground them, refocus them, all those things that we can do with the tools that we have. So I do think there's a lot of potential in that field. If anybody's interested to discuss this further, I'm
interesting one. Definitely interested. And I wonder, if you turn it around, what are the skills that crisis managers, those who call themselves crisis managers, but would not call themselves facilitators, what kind of add-on training or simply awareness would they need to expand their toolbox so that they can approach the next crisis meeting from this creative facilitative?
I think this is not speaking really from my experience only. I think it's about focusing on people and dynamics first and foremost. And having worked with many crises, this is very difficult because you're immediately sucked into, this is what the context throws at me, to what we discussed earlier. So I think that is definitely a skill, and not being scared of emotions, because also that the narrative of like you have to be rational and logical in a crisis, and really, I've said this for many years, but I've changed my mind completely, because I think I've noticed that that's where the solutions lie. Behind our emotional reactions is where the solutions to the crisis lie. And if you don't explore it, you, on the one hand, you will not learn, but on the other hand, they will come back. You will be faced with these emotions at one or the other point, and then they're even more difficult to handle. If you're there as a crisis manager to go into that and in your own, I admit, like I have also an emotional reactions. I'm actually really scared of this. Fine. What are you actually scared of? That you don't find a solution, that you lose your job, that you lose your face? Because those are often things that they're actually scared of, not the situation itself, but like, okay, I'm failing. I'm going to fail this. Not dealing with the responsibility. But the moment you have identified it and accepted it, you are a different person. It's like, yeah, I'm scared of it. Okay, let's do this. And so emotions, definitely. Of course, there's always process tools, I think, that they can learn from, but this might be a bit more difficult because you also have other tasks. So that's why I think the facilitator role is an important one. But these two I would certainly point out, dealing with people and maybe as an add-on, dealing with emotions.
Exciting. And final question, since you mentioned, so you wrote a book, looking forward to read it. And to what extent do you think you can learn this MacGyver mindset and applying facilitation to crisis from a book as opposed to experiencing? So where is then the balance? What are the parts that you can learn from a book, and what are the parts where you really need the training, the experience, and the routine that you described earlier that you would share through your workshops and trainings?
I don't think you can really learn from a book in that sense, because for me, learning is, if I define learning what it is for me, it's 3 steps. It's getting the information, it's making sense of it, and then doing something with it. And so the book would fall in the former category. And I wrote my book primarily to make sense of my thinking. So it was really a reflective book, which could be a guiding model. So I hope that people take something out of it. But the idea is not that they copy what I did in the book or what I suggest to do in the book. I mean, yes, there's exercises in it and there's practical ideas in it. But I'm a strong believer, as with every exercise and every method, they become individual with the person who uses it. So if you use perspectives ping pong, right? You use it differently. You use it the way you want to use it. It's just a method, and I use it differently and for different things. And this is the beauty of it. So you might get ideas, and I hope you get ideas from my book and others, maybe that stimulate your thinking. Maybe it's awareness raising of things that you didn't have on the screen before. And then you are responsible to translate it into your world. And once you've translated it, it's all about trying. And the MacGyver mindset is nothing else but practice and awareness. So what I do, and I really have, I probably go a bit to the extreme already with it, but I constantly, like whatever I look at, whatever I do, and you know, we've been working together, and we have you have also seen how I work. This is a constant question, like how could we do this differently? Like, is there anything we could do differently? And this is nothing else. I mean, this is a bit to the extreme, but it's also the MacGyver mindset, because this is how I think. Like, okay, is there something we can do with this which we haven't done before? This is also what drives me a little bit, both when it comes to facilitation, when it comes to new tools, when it comes to designing, because this is where I find I evolve, I develop as a person, and it expands my skill set. But it's practice. It's also a habit, like questioning constantly, can we do this differently? Is there something I can do with this glass that other than drink from it, for example? Yeah.
Wonderful. Looking forward to your book. And
soon.
For the practice sessions and conversations on how to nurture our MacGyver mindset and how to turn facilitators into crisis managers.
And vice versa.
And vice versa. Hell yes. Thank you so much, Thomas. It's always bliss and inspiration to speak with you.
Thank you very much. I really like your questions. They make me think. They are challenging, and they make us explore.